Hello, I'm Petley. I'm a Professor of History here at the University of Southampton, and I'm joined this afternoon by my friend and colleague Dr. Jonathan Conlin. Jonathan, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
And we're going to talk today, Jonathan, about your book, Mr. 5%, The Many Lives of Calouste Gulbenkian, the World's Richest Man. Gulbenkian, an Armenian, called Mr. 5% because he ends up owning 5% of all Middle East oil production. Born in 1869, dying in 1955. Okay. John, can you tell us a little bit about what drew you to study the life and times of Calouste Gulbenkian?
Well, it emerged from my first book, which was A History of the National Gallery in London. And one of the great hypotheticals in that story was surrounding Gulbenkian's original plan for his philanthropy, for his bequest, which was to leave his 5% and his art collection to the National Gallery, to the one in Trafalgar Square. Had that happened, not only would the gallery have had a few more very fine paintings, but it would have had enough money to reverse the loss of paintings to American galleries like the Metropolitan, the Getty, and other very much wealthier American institutions. So that was the first time I'd come across Gulbenkian. And then subsequently I was asked to give conference papers on him as a philanthropist. So in a sense, I was also, in that sense, starting at the wrong end, at the end of his life, looking at his pioneering vision for a truly transnational, even supranational philanthropy that would respect no borders.
Okay, great. So you come to him as somebody who's a philanthropist who's got this great wealth that he can donate to institutions like art galleries. And yet what you've written is the biography of the man throughout his life and times. And it seems to me perhaps a good place for us to start would be, could you, in just a minute or so, if that's possible, give us a sense of this man's life, what he did, what he achieved, and why we should remember him.
Yes, well, certainly one thing it isn't is a rags to riches story, in that he was born in Istanbul in 1869 into a Ottoman Armenian clan of merchants who belonged to the Amira, the merchant elite of the Ottoman Empire, who, under the notoriously fearsome Sultan Abdul Hamid, established themselves as the great mediators between Western capital finance and the declining Ottoman Empire, which was gradually falling apart at the edges. So he helps his father and his uncle with their merchant business, which is general import-export, and he quickly, having studied in Marseille and London, comes to see this is rather boring and decides to specialise initially in a rather racy corner of the London stock market, which is South African mining shares. And then that leads him to move into what's then a brand new area, which is the oil industry. Oil was then used as a lubricant and as an illuminant, as kerosene for lighting, but obviously not being used as a fuel really yet. And over the course of his life, the hydrocarbon revolution leads from that world, where oil is about grease and lighting, to the modern day world, where there's nothing in this room that we could look at or touch which doesn't contain some oil, plastic, or oil product of some kind. So his life is built around trying to coordinate that process, during which oil companies organize themselves around a cartel of what Anthony Sampson called the Seven Sisters. Today there are more than seven, but there are certainly, the oil industry today is organized around a cartel of maybe 15 to 20 majors or super majors, very large.
Big companies, big oil companies.
Multinational oil companies that don't call any one nation home. And Gulbenkian was perfect for this because he himself didn't call one nation home. He was constantly moving from one hotel to another. He held 4 different passports. He was certainly Armenian and never intended to be seen as anything else, but he was not someone interested in, as it were, the form of Armenian Zionism, in kind of creating an Armenian national homeland in and around what's now Eastern Turkey and the Republic of Armenia. So in that sense, he kind of turns his back on a certain emergent model of Armenian patriotism and chooses to become a citizen of nowhere. So that's perhaps another reason why today, as globalization is going into reverse, that it's useful to think about this man who survived the collapse of a great Ottoman Empire, sort of jumped on board another decaying empire, the British Empire in the Middle East, and saw the arrival of the American Empire in that region. But someone who was also active in oil-bearing areas in Venezuela, Mexico, the United States, and Russia as well.
So his life encompasses so much. 2 world wars and all of the other transformations that you've talked about, particularly the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire. That's very important in this. It seems perhaps there are 3 ways that we could talk about Gulbenkian's life. We can talk about Gulbenkian as a businessman. It would be interesting to come back to where we began, thinking about him as a philanthropist. And we might also, because it's a biography of Gulbenkian, think also about his private life and his family. And the question for me that really burns listening to you talking about his successes is how and why do you think it is that Gulbenkian is able to so successfully navigate this emerging and growing world of international oil?
Well, I think it helps that he's able to present himself as an honest broker, because his loyalties are on the one hand clear. He's Armenian, but in another sense, he's grown up in a period where Armenia is a figment of the imagination. The last Armenian state was taken over in 1348, and until there's a short-lived republic in 1919, which is quickly taken over by the Soviet Union, there isn't really a sovereign state of Armenia. So there's nobody around the tables when he's negotiating worried that he's following some secret orders from Yerevan, from the Armenian capital. So he's able to present himself, precisely because he's a man of nowhere, a citizen of nowhere, as someone able to see the big picture and able to balance competing, much more nationally organized interests.
So he's a bit of an outsider, and from somewhere that's been often peripheral. And so clearly that's a big challenge for somebody if you're an outsider, if you're from the periphery. How does he get in the room? How does Gulbenkian put himself in a position where he's able to wield this kind of influence?
Well, I think he's initially achieves this by dint of being Armenian, in that around 1900 the world's largest oil producing region was the United States, but the second largest and growing rapidly was the Russian Caucasus, where the leading magnates were all Armenians. And so he acts as a go-between between these Armenian oil barons and the Western cartels that are being put together by the companies we know as Shell, BP, and Standard Oil. And that gets him the foot in the door. What allows him to stay is that he develops a very close relationship with the mercurial head of Royal Dutch Shell, a Dutchman named Henri Daterding. And Henri Daterding is someone who's very always a genius, jumping from one idea to the other and hoovering up concessions for this relatively small oil company at the time. And expanding rapidly in the years around World War One, taking up concessions in oil concessions in Argentina, Venezuela, Mexico, California, right over to the Dutch, to what's now Indonesia and Malaysia. And he simply can't handle the detail, and he's not a diplomat at all. Whereas Gulbenkian is a softly spoken, someone who does deals, usually outside meetings in one-on-one settings, and someone who has a very strong work ethic and a strong eye for detail. So the two, Daterding and Gulbenkian, their strengths complement one another. And together they turn Royal Dutch Shell from a small company, which emerged from the merger in 1907 of Shell and Royal Dutch, into, by the interwar period, it's the world's largest international oil company. So that incredibly fast growth gives him the reputation as a truly international oil man of great stature. Unfortunately, that relationship breaks down in 1925, and Gulbenkian's on the outside again. But fortunately, by this point, the oil-producing countries are getting fed up of being exploited by the cartels of the oil companies, and his experience becomes a commodity he can sell to them. So he becomes an advisor to Persia, to Iran, as well as to Stalin and the Soviets, who are interested in finding someone who can help them have a slightly more control over the prices they're getting for their oil.
So we have here a man who is an organizer, a broker between all of these various, often competing entities, and somebody who it comes through very strongly in what you've written, works extremely hard. I mean, one way that we might think of someone like Gulbenkian now is as a workaholic. Is that a term that you think would apply to him?
Yes, I mean, I've called him Stakhanovite, which is perhaps gives a sense of the viciousness of it, the almost frightening focus that he had. One of his closest advisors, Cyril Radcliffe, spoke of his focus being actually almost intimidating, the sort of relentless attention he brought to things. But the softer side of that we see in the letters to his beloved, if errant son Nubar, which is that he loved work and enjoyed it for its own sake rather than for the prestige or the wealth that it brought. And I think he enjoyed the sort of cut and thrust of trying to stay alive, trying to hold on to his 5%, and if not make it bigger across his life. And it's striking that in 1945, when he's pretty old, most people will be thinking of retiring in their 80s, he's almost rejuvenated by what turns out to be a 3-year-long struggle with his associates, who are the super majors of the time, Royal Dutch Shell, British Petroleum, and what's now ExxonMobil. And he's just one man. He doesn't have a company. He doesn't have any geologists working for him. He's running out of 2 very small offices. So he's a tiny little David among all these Goliaths, and yet he clearly enjoys running rings around them.
And this eventually brings him huge wealth. I mean, you've told us that he's born into wealth, and he becomes wealthier through all of the exploits that you've been describing. But it's actually towards the very end of his life that he becomes the world's richest man. Can you tell us a little bit about that? How that comes about? How does he become the world's richest man?
Well, he makes his first fortune really through sales commissions. Royal Dutch Shell will give him 1 or 2% of their total sales into a region in return for him getting the ball rolling by setting up some distribution for the company. Those 1 and 2% turn out to be very valuable as people come up with ever more uses for petroleum, not least after the navies are converted from coal to oil and we start getting cars everywhere. But in terms of making money directly from producing oil, from his 5% of Middle East oil, that takes quite a while. He has to really sit on that concession and invest a significant amount of money in building pipelines and refineries. I mean, that's the thing we often forget about the oil industry, is that you don't just put a straw in the ground and oil comes out. Oil is often in hard to reach areas. It needs to be transported. There's a lot of physical plant that needs to be built before you bring a single drop of oil to market. So it's only in 1935 that he begins to get some oil out of the Middle East. And only really after 1950, when a much bigger pipeline comes on stream, that he starts earning an amount of money which, combined with his age, he's in his 80s by that point, it is, I think, literally impossible for him truly to grasp how wealthy he has become. And that is a problem, because it's just the point where he's thinking about his legacy and about his foundation. And to lose focus, it's difficult to be focused about something if you cannot conceive it in its entirety, if your imagination cannot grasp it.
His son could grasp it, couldn't he? And I think look forward to becoming wealthy himself, and is a very different kind of character.
Yeah, I mean, his son was much more publicity-seeking, whereas Gulbenkian hated publicity, would never have sat down with you or any other interviewer during his lifetime. But his son was very much someone who enjoyed the trappings of the rich life. Yeah. To be fair, it was made clear to him from a young age that he wasn't going to inherit the vast majority of the fortune, that it was going to go to a charitable end. But his father did hope that he would set himself up as an independent figure in the oil industry. something which, as a father, he was never fully able to let go, and so perhaps inevitably Newbar, the son, never really made it on his own.
And what's his wider relationship like with his family? We've got a man here who's working extremely hard. We've said a little bit about his relationship with his son. Did he find any time to enjoy family life?
He's someone who was very openly referred to himself as having an Oriental mindset towards family. I think he was often using these labels, fully aware of the Orientalist assumptions behind them, but actually sort of turning them against those who would apply them to him to demean him. He certainly felt that he had a right to control his children, to decide who they married, that they married fellow Armenians, if at all possible, and also that he as a spare time relaxation, he would check over their accounts, finding out exactly how much money they had spent on taxis or on food, and then interrogating them on any waste that he saw. But in a way, as a biographer, this was wonderful for me, because I was very concerned the book might become nothing but a series of one deal after another. And so the dysfunctionality of the family, he and his wife had a very rocky marriage. His son tries to sue him at one point. His daughter runs away, abandoning her child, Gulbenkian's only grandchild. So there's so much there going on, which allowed me to give the reader a break between, as it were, the deals and the more family side, to weave them into each other.
This family side, which adds another kind of colour to the book.
Yeah, and also just on a basic level of readership, I think we all enjoy a certain amount of schadenfreude from seeing that incredible wealth does not bring happiness. I mean, we know that's true in our heads, but in our hearts, I think we often on a daily basis doubt that. And wealth did not make Gulbenkian a very happy man.
What did he think it was for? What did Gulbenkian think money was for?
I think he thought money was a way of isolating yourself from reliance or dependence on other people or on a state for the provision of public services, for example. He hated paying taxes. I mean, who doesn't? But he really did not understand that if we pay taxes, or the deal is we pay taxes in return for certain services that we actually need and find useful. This is perhaps a legacy of being Armenian in the Ottoman Empire, where the ethnic group, the millet, was largely self-governing. They were second-class citizens, but they didn't vote. They didn't have to bear arms. So they weren't. He already came into a mindset which is not one of citizenship.
And what did he spend his money on? Did he? There's things in your book about him dressing fairly simply, but in other ways he has quite an extravagant life. He spends money on artwork, doesn't he?
Well, he wouldn't have seen art. Yeah, he wouldn't have seen art as extravagant. I think he saw art as a kind of refuge, in the same way that he built a garden near Deauville, which is now a public park, as a kind of refuge to be alone in and to take comfort from when deals weren't going his way. I think so. He spent a lot of the money on this estate, on building gardens, and on acquiring works of art, including most notoriously Rembrandt's and other works of art which Stalin sells from the Hermitage Museum, an issue which remains controversial. So I think he was spending that art on things that gave him solace, and then he was also very generous in lending those works of art, and of course left his art collection to the foundation that bears his name.
And could you tell us a bit about that, because this is where most of the Gulbenkian wealth ends up?
Yes. The odd thing is that the foundation remains the 36th wealthiest foundation in the world, has a fantastically large amount of money, several billion euros in endowment, and yet outside its home of Portugal it's not really well known. Gulbenkian wanted the philanthropy, wanted his charity to be for the world, for all humanity, in the same way the Rockefeller Foundation is today. But unfortunately he didn't really do due diligence on Portugal as a regime in which to base his foundation, and in the end, with the help of the then dictator Salazar, it was effectively nationalized at birth in its foundation a year after Gulbenkian died. and has until fairly recently spent the vast majority of its largesse within Portugal, which is a relatively small country on which to spend a vast amount of money. So one of the most controversial elements of the book is the epilogue, in which I describe what happens in the immediate wake of his death, showing how specifically one of his advisors turned out to be effectively collaborating with Salazar to ensure that the foundation became a gift to Portugal.
Okay. So this is how the book ends then, with this big foundation being created from his wealth. And you talk about that as being part of the end of the book, and one of the things that you found in this project that you perhaps weren't expecting to find at the beginning, and that goes beyond perhaps just the Gulbenkian story. And I wondered if we could talk a little bit more about what you want to do with the book, other than just tell the story of Calouste Gulbenkian. I mean, there's things in there about empire, about globalization, about technology and the rise of this huge oil industry, leaving alone the foundation, which is another fascinating story about philanthropy. What are the bigger themes in the book beyond the man at the centre of it?
Well, I think you can read the book as a history of the world oil industry, in that, with a few exceptions, every oil-producing area of the first half of the 20th century is in there, because Gulbenkian's tentacles reached everywhere. And so, yes, he can be seen as a lens on that story. I also think globalization is a very sort of prescient element of the book, in that Gulbenkian was born and thrived in the pre-World War One, what's often seen as the first era of globalization, and then has to survive in the interwar period when currency barriers, trade barriers are put up, the Great Depression, all that sort of thing. And in our age, jumping forward, arguably after 1989, 1990, we entered a new era of globalization, which has now come to an end. So I think the questions that he raises of migration, he's a migrant after all, he's not quite a refugee, but he's a migrant. It's interesting, I think, to look at his life as life of someone who's always on the move, and thinking about, well, how do we view people who are on the move? Are they a threat? Or is this something about in the modern condition, are we all on the move? Is this simply a man who's ahead of his time, who is living a life that we would now recognize as one that's familiar, at least to some of us? So I think that was what I hoped people might get out of that.
Okay, thank you, John.
Thank you.
That has been fascinating, a really exciting and rich tour through Gulbenkian and the book that you've written about him. Thank you for your time.
Okay, how long was that?
About 20 minutes, I think.
20?
Yeah.
Oh, it's got a red light. Wow, it's heavy.
That okay?
Yeah.